Hey, in this vid, I want to talk about what the State Department would normally do when a country like Brazil would attack a U.S. multinational tech company. So I don't see this Brazil censorship situation as being a Brazil situation. I see this being the U.S. State Department. I see this being the U.S. foreign policy establishment. I see this being the U.S. blob operating through Brazil as a proxy and supporting behind the scenes what Brazil is doing with the censorship actions that are now forcing X out of the country. So let me break down what I mean here. So the blob fears populism. Okay, the U.S. foreign policy establishment fears the rise of domestic populist groups in the U.S. and around the world, in NATO countries and in BRICS countries, like Brazil, BRICS. So here's what's happening here. A couple of years ago, I wrote a report, which I was very shocked to discover at the time. I should say I was shocked at the extent of it, but basically it turned out that when I was looking into what was behind censorship in Brazil, it turned out that what was driving it appeared to be a gaggle of U.S. State Department funded NGOs, and not just State Department funded NGOs, but they were actually National Endowment for Democracy funded as well. You had USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy funding a bunch of domestic censorship groups in Brazil. This actually goes right back to the beginning of Bolsonaro's tenure in 2019. In June 2019, the Atlantic Council convened a meeting about what to do about the rise of disinformation in Brazil that was pro-Bolsonaro in nature. And the Atlantic Council's panel, called Election Watch in June 2019, bemoaned the fact that in Brazil, people were paying more attention to their own friends, family, and clergy than they were to institutions, global institutions, such as the Atlantic Council, which is a CIA pass-through. It has 7 CIA directors on its board. It's annually funded every year by the Pentagon, the State Department, and the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a CIA cutout. Now, in addition to that, a bunch of these university centers in Brazil and civil society groups get National Endowment for Democracy funding. That is a CIA pass-through. So this is the CIA and State Department and USAID directly funding, in June 2019, the censorship apparatus in Brazil against pro-Bolsonaro groups. See, in 2019, social media was already censored in Brazil. Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube censorship in Brazil hit them really hard, the same way that it did in the US. So Bolsonaro supporters switched to WhatsApp and Telegram to spread their messaging because they were basically kicked off of Facebook. This is why one of the biggest audiences for Gab, one of the first free speech sort of alternative platform attempts, was the Brazilian population in 2018, 2019, because they were hit with that first wave of censorship hard. So what the Atlantic Council and a bunch of these other National Endowment for Democracy funded CIA proxies did is they then descended on WhatsApp and Telegram. And they promoted these little organs, these little activists, these little proxies within Brazil to put pressure on the Brazilian government to take out WhatsApp and Telegram until WhatsApp and Telegram also censored populist supporters, right-wing populist nationalist Bolsonaro supporters. And so that led to WhatsApp putting caps on the amount of messages that could be forwarded. And it led to them basically shutting down the ability to approximate the size of a Facebook group. They vastly reduced the amount of people who could populate a single group in order to basically balkanize pro-Bolsonaro speech. And then when Telegram refused to censor misinformation, they actually shut down Telegram in the country until it bent the knee to the government. So when it came out by The Intercept a couple years later, The Intercept reported this last year. They were surprised. They said, it turns out that the State Department and the CIA directly intervened in Brazil's election, the Lula election, in order to stop Bolsonaro supporters from being able to challenge the election results or challenge the issues around mail-in ballots. This is the CIA, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, and the State Department deploying your taxpayer dollars in order to censor Brazilians talking about their own election, because they wanted Bolsonaro to lose. Now, it gets a lot darker here too, because remember, if they were censoring, pro-Biden speech well, actually, one more thing. So again, Bolsonaro was like Trump of the tropics. That's the way that he was touted. The blob, the foreign policy establishment, feared a new non-aligned movement, which was the scourge of our blob during the Cold War in the form of all these populist countries. Bolsonaro was part of this wing along with Orban and a bunch of right-wing populist groups in Europe, and he was insufficiently anti-Russia on a number of things. I can get to that another time. But essentially, here's what would normally happen if a foreign country like Brazil did what it just did. And you can think of it as if Brazil was choosing to censor pro-Biden neoliberal groups in Brazil, this is what would happen as well. So the first thing that would happen is the State Department would come rushing in. Because the State Department is sort of the head of that trifecta there, with the State Department, DOD, and CIA. That's our foreign policy establishment. So the first thing is the State Department would send a delegation and say, hey, Brazil, you are reliant on us for trade in these three respects. We have, you're reliant on us for funding of your civil society in these respects. You're reliant on us for security guarantees in certain respects. You depend on us for some of this, supply chain infrastructure. Hey, if you want to keep that, then you're going to rescind this law that you just passed, or this ruling that just came down from your Supreme Court that's hurting a U.S. national champion operating in your area. This is what the State Department would do for Microsoft, for Apple, and for Facebook, by the way, because this gets to another issue here around favors in the favor bank. Okay. One of the reasons that tech companies do favors to the federal government, everyone's like, why did Facebook give in? Because Zuckerberg did not want to do the censorship that Facebook ultimately ended up doing. He's not a diehard, ideologue on the censorship issue. In fact, he complained in 2019 about censorship going too far, and then he bent the knee. And, because Facebook is an example where Facebook doesn't rely on the government for a lot of government contracts in the same way that Amazon and Apple and Microsoft do. But they are reliant on the government to protect them. They are reliant on the State Department to negotiate on their behalf, on the State Department to pressure foreign countries to make sure that alternative Facebooks don't rise, or that the data laws in that country don't negatively impact Facebook, or that the advertising laws, you name it. And so, in this case, we just passed sanctions on Iran last summer for Iran engaging in government censorship of civilian groups. That is, we banned multiple private companies in Iran. We put sanctions on the Iranian government, kicking them off of the U.S. dollar, these folks, for engaging in censorship in Iran. Now, of course, this was because the CIA was backing these proxy groups during this Green Revolution to try to overthrow the government. And so when Iran pushed back on the CIA-backed groups, then suddenly sanctions. The U.S. State Department here is not going to threaten sanctions on Iran for this. I'm sorry, sanctions on Brazil on this. The U.S. State Department is not going to send a delegation to Brazil and say, hey, if you want to benefit from America as a trade partner, if you want us to continue doing favors for you, you're going to shut down this new situation with hurting U.S. national champions in the form of Twitter/X in Brazil. But that's not going to happen here. And that's not going to happen here because the State Department is behind it, okay? I would not be surprised if the State Department has had these back. I know this came from a Supreme Court ruling in Brazil. But I can almost guarantee you, if the House Foreign Affairs Committee launches an investigation on this and goes to the Western Hemisphere, that's the regional desk that's going to cover Brazil, and looks at their communications with the Brazilian government, you're going to find that disinformation it's going to be chock full there, and it's all going to be targeted at the right-wing populist groups that they call a pipeline from Bolsonaro to Trumpism. And you can actually go to the FFO article that I wrote on this 2 years ago, and you can watch the playthrough videos, which I embedded in the report, which showed U.S. aid and NED, that's CIA-backed professors in Brazil, talking about how by shutting down these pro-Bolsonaro groups, it will shut down support for Trumpism. Well, ain't that great for the Biden administration? They're spending your tax dollars to promote censorship in a foreign country to take out a U.S. national champion.